It began with a whisper in the autumn of 2025. Old walls at the Maryland Institute College of Art carried an echo of something buried, a story long forgotten. When the story broke, Baltimore's art scene trembled. People who had spent their lives celebrating beauty, color, and form were suddenly forced to face the darkness hidden beneath those same canvases. 56 years earlier, in 1969, a young artist named Evelyn Ross vanished without a trace. She had been one of the most promising talents in her class, a painter whose haunting portraits captured something disturbingly alive in the stillness of her subjects. Her disappearance shocked the small academic community, but after months of fruitless searching, the case went cold. Over the decades, her name lingered only in whispers, part tragedy, part mystery, part myth. Now, more than half a century later, a discovery had changed everything. It was supposed to be a routine renovation. Workers had begun restoring an unused wing of the art school, one that had been sealed for years after a fire in the 1970s. Behind the crumbling plaster and rot, they found something unexpected, a narrow crawl space hidden by a false wall. Inside were several items: paintbrushes, a set of sketches, old canvas rolls carefully wrapped in linen, and something that shouldn't have been there at all, a human skull. At first, investigators thought it might have been a medical model, the kind often used in anatomy studies. But within hours, forensic technicians confirmed the obvious truth. It was real. The discovery reignited one of Baltimore's oldest cold cases, sending detectives back into archives that hadn't been opened in decades. Among those watching the case unfold was the art school's renowned historian, Professor Alan Whitford. Charismatic, articulate, and revered in the academic world, Whitford had built a career studying the artistic movements of the late 1960s, particularly those connected to mica. He had published books, lectured internationally, and mentored countless rising artists. To most, he was a cornerstone of Baltimore's cultural identity. But as the investigation deepened, small inconsistencies began to surface. An old attendance record placed Evelyn Ross in one of Whitford's private workshops just days before her disappearance. Archived letters revealed she'd been seen arguing with him about a painting that, according to police reports, vanished around the same time she did. The painting, rumored to be her masterpiece, was never recovered. By the second week, detectives reclassified the case from accidental death to homicide. The art community buzzed with speculation. Could Whitford have known something about Evelyn's fate? Was he protecting someone? Or had he simply been in the wrong place at the wrong time? The press surrounded his townhouse in Mount Vernon, flashing cameras catching glimpses of the stoic academic who, for the first time in decades, looked uncertain. Meanwhile, forensic experts uncovered traces of pigment particles embedded in the skull's surface. It was as if the remains had been near wet paint for an extended period, specifically oil-based titanium white, a common pigment used in the late 1960s. The connection between art and death could no longer be ignored. Days later, the school archives yielded a chilling detail. One of the missing canvases had reappeared in a private European collection in the early 1980s. The signature was faded, but unmistakably Evelyn's. The gallery record listed its prior owner as A. Whitford. It was enough to secure a warrant. When agents arrived at Whitford's home, they expected to find old documents or forgotten records. What they found instead was an entire collection of early Baltimore art. Dozens of student works, many unsigned, others attributed to unknown artists. Hidden among them were several small canvases that stylistically matched Evelyn's last series. In the attic, neatly stacked under drop cloths, investigators found something even stranger: frames containing textured underpaintings covered by layers of later work. Each was signed by famous names Whitford had helped authenticate during his career. As the forensic team scraped away the paint, faces began to emerge. Faces from old photographs of missing students, hauntingly realistic, detailed, and silent. Baltimore's art community erupted. Professors refused to comment. Galleries canceled exhibitions. Students gathered in candlelight vigils for Evelyn Ross, whose killer, it seemed, had walked among them for decades. Celebrated as one of the city's cultural giants. When pressed for a statement, Whitford's voice was calm but eerily detached. "Art," he said to the cameras, "is about preserving what time wants to erase. Some things are meant to stay hidden. The comment only fueled suspicion. Within days, DNA analysis confirmed that the remains belonged to Evelyn. Investigators now began piecing together a timeline. The last night she was seen alive, the hidden studio she once shared with her mentor, and the trail of paintings that seemed to bear silent witness to what really happened that night in 1969. But before the authorities could locate all the missing evidence, Whitford vanished. He left behind a short letter addressed to the dean of the college. The message was brief, its handwriting uneven as if written in haste. For 50 years I gave the world beauty to distract it from its own ugliness. I only regret that it took a corpse to make people look closer. The investigation was far from over, but one truth had already emerged. The past wasn't buried in the school's walls. It had been carefully preserved layer upon layer, beneath the paint itself, and Baltimore was about to uncover just how deep those layers went. For 3 days, the city of Baltimore buzzed with whispers and police sirens. Professor Alan Whitford, once a fixture of the city's cultural heart, had disappeared without warning. His grey sedan was found abandoned along the Patapsco River, its keys still in the ignition. Inside, investigators found a single item, a sketchbook wrapped in a linen cloth, bound with oil-stained twine. The initials ER were faintly etched on the cover. Detectives opened it with careful hands. Inside were portraits, rough, hurried sketches of a young woman with expressive eyes and long auburn hair. Evelyn Ross. Every page showed her in a different pose, painting, smiling, glancing over a shoulder, sitting by the window of an art studio drenched in evening light. At first glance, it seemed like the work of an enamored teacher memorializing a gifted student. But the final pages told a different story. The sketches grew darker, more fragmented. The eyes blurred into smudges, the outlines distorted. In one of the last drawings, Evelyn's face was half-finished. Streaks of black crayon obscured her mouth, and beneath the sketch, a phrase appeared in small, faint handwriting. She wouldn't stop seeing. Investigators sent the book to the lab, hoping for fingerprints or traces of age that could place its origin in the timeline. While forensics worked, detectives turned their focus to Whitford's past, his colleagues, his early career, and any remaining witnesses from 1969 who might shed light on his connection to Evelyn Ross. Among those still alive was Margaret Maggie Holloway, Evelyn's former roommate. Now 80, she lived alone in a nursing facility outside Towson. Her hands trembled when detectives presented old photographs, but her voice, though cracked by time, carried the weight of memory. "Evelyn adored him," she said softly. "We all did. He made us feel like what we painted mattered." But something changed that spring. She stopped smiling in his classes. She said he'd found something special in her last painting, something he couldn't let go. Maggie hesitated before continuing. That summer she told me she was leaving school, said she couldn't take it anymore. The stares, the pressure, the feeling that her art wasn't hers anymore. Detectives noted every word. Maggie's testimony hinted at obsession, at a relationship that blurred the line between mentorship and control. In 1969, Whitford had been in his early 30s, brilliant and charming, already building a name as the youngest associate professor in Mica history. Evelyn, barely 21, had been his most talented pupil. When she vanished, police suspected she'd run away. Whitford claimed she'd left for New York to pursue her career. No foul play, no evidence, and soon no investigation. But buried beneath the decades, new evidence had started to speak. Back at police headquarters, analysts revealed something stunning. The paint chips taken from the skull not only contained titanium white, but also traces of a rare pigment called lead chromate, yellow, a compound banned in the US by the mid-1970s. The mixture matched perfectly with a restored painting known as Study in Reflection, one of Whitford's authenticated discoveries. From the early 1980s, the painting's provenance, once thought solid, now appeared forged. The face on the canvas? Evelyn Ross. Every expert called in had the same reaction: shock. None could comprehend how a work supposedly painted by a 19th century artist could bear the features of a student who disappeared nearly a century later. The evidence was devastating. It suggested Whitford had reused old canvases, painting over his stolen works to construct fakes he later sold or donated. In short, he'd been hiding bodies in his art. not literally, but symbolically, using layers of pigment to erase the truth. Detective Karen Neal, the lead investigator, summarized it bluntly during a late-night press briefing. What we're uncovering isn't just a case of murder. It's a decades-long masquerade. Professor Whitford may have built his entire reputation atop a graveyard of stolen talent. The revelation rippled across the academic world. Students came forward with strange memories, private lessons that felt secretive, art assignments where Whitford insisted they abandon themselves to the canvas. One recalled being asked to destroy a painting she loved because it held too much truth in the eyes. She never understood that comment until now. Meanwhile, the manhunt expanded across state lines. The FBI joined in after surveillance footage placed Whitford at a gas station outside Philadelphia the morning after his disappearance. He looked disheveled but calm, paying in cash, his expression unreadable. Witnesses said he carried a single canvas wrapped in brown paper and a backpack heavy enough to strain his shoulders. 2 days later, the sketchbook resurfaced again in the most unexpected place, a small art gallery in Canton. The owner claimed it was mailed to them anonymously, postmarked from Delaware. Inside the package was a simple note, typed, not handwritten, reading, "The truth is in what she painted last. Authorities rushed to locate Evelyn's final painting." But according to the school's records, it had never been catalogued, never photographed, and officially it didn't exist. Still, the clues pointed somewhere, to the sealed studio space beneath the old art building, where the original discovery had taken place. When the police descended into that darkness again, their flashlights moved across walls thick with dust and time. Beneath a fallen beam, barely covered under debris and canvas scraps, they found a wooden trunk. Inside was a single rolled painting, brittle and darkened with age. The restoration team worked through the night to reveal what lay beneath. As the varnish softened and the grime lifted, the image became clear. A woman sitting in a chair, her face both serene and haunting. Her eyes were vivid, the same deep brown captured in Evelyn's early sketches, but her mouth was painted shut, sealed under layers of white, as if silenced forever. Beneath the painting's frame, carved into the wood, were the initials AW. The discovery left no doubt. This was Evelyn's final work, and her silent accusation. Now every part of Whitford's life was under the microscope. Every exhibition, every painting, every authentication he ever approved. He might have spent decades turning ghosts into masterpieces, and the world had applauded him for it, but the mask was cracking. And somewhere out there, Alan Whitford was still painting his version of the truth. Baltimore awoke that morning under a pale, heavy fog that crawled from the harbor into the city's narrow streets. News vans lined the entrance of the Maryland Institute College of Art, their antennas jutting into the sky like cold metal fingers. By now the institution had become a crime scene, a place where paintings, once symbols of creativity, were treated as potential evidence. Detective Karen Neal stepped through the barricade, exhaustion etched into her face. She had barely slept in 2 days. Her team had catalogued everything from Whitford's home, from his university office, and now from the sealed basement that had kept its secrets buried since 1969. Still, something didn't make sense. Why had Whitford left the sketchbook behind? Why vanish when the truth was closing in? Most people would have fled to escape. Whitford, Neal suspected, fled to make a point. Later that morning, in a cluttered conference room filled with crime scene photos and stacks of lab reports, Neal and her team reviewed the recovered painting, Evelyn's final work. Experts determined that the surface had been tampered with multiple times. Microscopic analysis revealed hidden brushstrokes beneath the visible layers, faint outlines of another figure, standing behind Evelyn's image. Painted over roughly in thicker pigment, the figure's face was partially visible when infrared scans were applied. Male, angular features with an expression neither peaceful nor aggressive, but disturbingly intimate. There was no doubt. It was Whitford himself. The discovery rewrote the entire narrative. What had once seemed like a teacher documenting his student now appeared as something far darker, an act of possession, a merging of identities through art. Whitford hadn't simply taught Evelyn Ross. He had tried to immortalize her by consuming her image, one layer at a time. As forensic technicians pieced together the chronology of pigments, dates and varnish types, The press began to swarm the courthouse steps. Artists, critics, and curators flooded social media with theories. Some defended Whitford, calling him misunderstood, a martyr to artistic obsession. Others branded him a monster who had turned art into a crime scene. Across the city, galleries closed for the first time in protest, locking away any piece that bore his signature. Then, late in the afternoon, an unmarked envelope arrived at the police station. No return address. Inside, a small USB drive and a letter, typed on an old manual typewriter. The message was short. "You're looking for the wrong thing. Art is destruction, not creation." The USB contained a video, grainy, black and white, filmed in what looked like an old studio. A man's silhouette stood before a large canvas, painting slowly. His voice, distorted by age and audio decay, was unmistakably Whitford's. "People think art captures life," he said, the brush tapping against the canvas. "But it doesn't. It replaces it. Every stroke, every shade, it becomes what memory cannot." That's what Evelyn never understood. The video stopped abruptly. At the end, a frame flashed with coordinates, latitude and longitude. When investigators traced the location, it led to an abandoned farmhouse outside Ellicott City, about 30 minutes from Baltimore. By nightfall, Detective Neal and her team were on the road, headlights cutting through the fog. The farmhouse stood at the edge of a wooded lot, windows shattered, ivy crawling up its walls. Inside, the air smelled of turpentine and dust. Easels lined the main room, each holding a painting draped in cloth. The silence was thick, the kind that presses against your ears until it vibrates. When Neal pulled back the first cloth, she froze. It was Evelyn again, this time several renditions of her face, painted over and over, each slightly different. In one, her eyes were open, alive. In another, closed, serene. In the third, half erased, replaced by Whitford's own features. The layering was deliberate, obsessive. Her partner Jason turned to inspect the next portrait, but the moment he lifted the cover, he stepped back, shaken. It was not Evelyn. It was Margaret Holloway, the aged version, recent and fragile as she was now. Yet the painting looked freshly made, wet even. Whitford had painted her again after her testimony, from memory or perhaps from a hidden photograph. The chilling implication was clear. He was still watching those who spoke about him. In the corner of the farmhouse, a new canvas stood facing the wall. When Neal turned it around, the sight drew a collective breath from everyone in the room. It was a self-portrait, Whitford old and hollow-eyed but smiling faintly. His right hand was extended, offering a paintbrush toward the viewer. His left was smeared with crimson pigment that looked disturbingly like blood. Pinned to the bottom of the frame was another note, handwritten this time. It was never about murder. It was about permanence. Forensics would later confirm the DNA traces on the brush belonged to Whitford himself, his blood, not of victims. The realization landed hard. The professor was painting his final confession. Each image a statement, each detail an explanation only he could understand. Outside, the night grew colder. Federal agents expanded their search through the surrounding woods. No sign of the professor. No footprints. No discarded tools. Nothing but the faint hum of crickets and the smell of linseed oil clinging to the air. Back in the city, the news exploded. Whitford's Farm of Shadows, the papers called it. Experts debated whether what he left behind was evidence of madness or genius. To many, it didn't matter anymore. The question haunting everyone was simple. If this was his message, where was he? Then the next morning, Baltimore's inner harbor delivered its answer. A local fisherman reported finding a small wooden crate floating near the docks. Inside, sealed and wrapped in waterproof sheeting, was another painting. There depicted the Patapsco River at sunrise, warm orange hues, shimmering reflections, almost peaceful. But if one looked closer, faint figures could be seen in the water's reflection. One was clearly Evelyn. Another bore Whitford's unmistakable features. The final scene seemed to tell its own story. The professor had joined his muse. Detective Neal stared at the painting for hours. There was no proof of his death, no body, no suicide note, but something inside her told her the case had reached its last brushstroke. A final work of art, completed by the one man who refused to separate life from creation. By the end of the week, the Baltimore Museum of Art issued a statement. All works attributed to Alan Whitford were to be removed, pending verification. But whispers lingered that somewhere, hidden in private collections across Europe, his ghost still lived, painted quietly into the corners of canvases people had stared at for decades without ever really seeing. And as the fog rolled in over Baltimore again, that silence returned, the kind that feels less like the absence of sound and more like the pause before another secret begins to surface. The city changed after that. Downtown Baltimore, usually alive with the energy of students, exhibitions, and Friday night crowds, felt subdued. The art district grew quiet. The once revered name Alan Whitford now hung like a stain across the walls of every gallery that had ever hosted his work. Detective Karen Neal sat in her office, surrounded by photographs of paintings, dozens of them, each connected to Whitford in one way or another. Most were reproductions obtained from collectors or museums, some authentic, others fraudulent. She stared at them like they were pieces of a missing puzzle. Patterns were beginning to emerge. In nearly every painting authenticated by Whitford during the 1970s and 1980s, the same detail reappeared, tiny brushstrokes forming the faint outline of a hand, concealed within shadows or reflected surfaces. It was a signature that no one had ever noticed before. To the world, these were brilliant restorations. To Neal, they now looked like confessions hiding in plain sight. Her phone buzzed. It was the lab. The painting retrieved from the harbor, the one showing Evelyn and Whitford reflected in the river, contained an embedded fingerprint, pressed into the lower layer of the paint before it dried. The prints matched Whitford's, but there was something else. Embedded microscopic fibers matched the canvas found in the farmhouse, suggesting both works came from the same roll of material. In other words, he'd taken his last canvas with him before disappearing. The implications were unsettling. He hadn't drowned by accident or despair. He had planned the ending meticulously, down to the symbolism of his final work. Later that afternoon, Neal met with Joseph Krell, the art conservator, leading the forensic restorations. The man leaned over one of Whitford's canvases, eyes sharp behind magnifiers, his hands steady despite the weight of what they were uncovering. "There's something genius about him," Krell whispered, as if afraid to speak too loudly. He mimicked old masters so perfectly because he understood decay, how paintings age, how color dies. But underneath, he pointed to a thin line emerging from the underpainting. Underneath, he left his own history. Every forgery is carved with his guilt. Neal studied the unfinished section. There were faint scratches under the pigment, letters, numbers perhaps. She called in a UV scan, and slowly the marks took shape into words. "She still watches." They both stood silent for a long moment, the phrase glowing eerily beneath the paint. Whitford had been communicating through his art, long before his crimes came to light. Every forged masterpiece, every restoration, carried a hidden narrative. For decades he built a gallery of ghosts, immortalizing those he believed the world would forget. Evelyn wasn't his first obsession, just the one who got too close to seeing his truth. The next morning, while reviewing archived interview tapes from old exhibitions, Neal caught something chilling. A 1985 television segment showed Whitford discussing artistic preservation. Midway through the talk, a reporter asked how he chose which works to restore. Whitford smiled faintly and said, "I only bring back those who deserve another life." No one questioned it at the time. Now the words felt like a quiet confession that had gone unnoticed for 40 years. That same day, a call came in from Interpol. A London gallery had found one of Whitford's authenticated paintings during a private collection appraisal, a portrait titled "The Girl with the Birch Leaves." But this time, the gallery owner reported something strange. After the varnish began cracking, a second image appeared underneath. It was the same woman who appeared in Whitford's farmhouse paintings, Evelyn Ross. Neal, arranged for the piece to be brought back to the US. The analysis confirmed beyond doubt that it was originally painted in 1969. Somehow, Whitford had smuggled Evelyn's work out of the country, repainted over it, and sold it as a 19th century piece. He hadn't only taken her life, he'd taken her art, her identity, and disguised her as his own legacy. The motive had never been profit. It was envy, possession, immortality through substitution. By the evening, the task force convened one last meeting in the department briefing room. Dozens of photographs covered the board, A lifetime of replicas, reattributions, and lies. At the center, Evelyn's final painting, her eyes alive with quiet accusation. Neil spoke softly. He built a cathedral out of stolen souls. Every portrait was a tombstone. Every restoration, an epitaph. The room was silent. Hours later, long after the headquarters had emptied, Neil remained alone. She stared again at Evelyn's portrait, not as evidence but as testimony. A single tear of resin had formed near the corner of the canvas, where the varnish had cracked under the studio heat, almost like the painting itself was still shedding grief. In a private moment of reflection, Neil realized Whitford had achieved what he always wanted. His art had made the world remember her, and him forever entwined, neither able to exist without the other. 2 days later, a man hiking along a remote stretch of the Patapsco River reported finding something wedged between tree roots, a fragment of wood, faintly lacquered. The lab confirmed it was part of a picture frame, and carved into the back was another set of initials, not AW but ER beneath it. Third date, October 26, 1969, the exact day Evelyn vanished. The discovery reignited speculation. Had Evelyn completed that last painting herself? Or had Whitford merely finished it for her, rewriting her identity within his own work? Experts debated endlessly, but no one could agree on where one artist ended and the other began. In time, Whitford's works were locked away in climate-controlled archives, not displayed but preserved, as if the institution feared his art could still whisper from beneath its layers. Years passed. People moved on. The scandal became legend. Yet for those who had seen the truth, the detectives, the restorers, Evelyn's aging classmates, the feeling never left. That within every great masterpiece lies something hidden beneath the surface, something human, something irreversible. And on quiet nights in the museum's storage vault, when the lights dimmed and the air thickened with dust and silence, some swore the faint smell of linseed oil and turpentine still drifted through the corridors, as if Whitford was still there, working quietly on his final masterpiece. Somewhere, between the layers of truth and the thin edge of a brushstroke, eternity had taken its final form. In 2026, a year after the investigation officially closed, Baltimore prepared for something both daring and controversial, a public exhibition titled The Evelyn Ross Collection. Sponsored by the state and curated by the museum's restoration department, it aimed to display the recovered paintings from the Whitford investigation for the first time. Not as art, but as artifacts of truth. The idea divided the city. Some saw it as justice. Evelyn's work finally reclaimed and recognized. Others called it exploitation, turning tragedy into spectacle. Yet when the doors opened on a cold February morning, the line stretched around the block. People came from across the country to witness what the newspapers had called the most haunted art in America. The gallery's main hall was silent, except for the soft hum of temperature monitors. The paintings hung on matte black walls under controlled light. Each bore a small brass plaque, Evelyn Ross 1969, but underneath in smaller type another phrase read, "Recovered from the Whitford collection." The atmosphere was reverent, almost sacred. Visitors spoke in hushed tones, as though disturbing something fragile might awaken the ghosts of those who had suffered in silence for decades. Detective Karen Neal stood to one side, watching faces as they passed. Some visitors stared in awe. Others couldn't look for long. It wasn't the gruesome details that unsettled them. It was the humanity. The eyes in the portraits seemed alive, aware, as if each subject knew they had finally been seen. Evelyn's final painting was placed at the center of the exhibit, the portrait with her sealed mouth, the one Whitford had hidden beneath layers of pigment. It was enclosed in glass now, resting on a specially constructed frame that revealed its stratified layers under ultraviolet light. The effect was chilling. Visitors could see the buried images beneath her own, the faint outlines of other faces Whitford had erased. Beside the glass case, a video loop played archival footage from Evelyn's classmates, sharing memories of her energy, her defiance, and her refusal to be shaped by others. For many of them, this exhibition was not a moment of scandal but of closure. Neil hadn't spoken publicly since the end of the case, but when a journalist approached her quietly that morning and asked what the investigation had taught her, She answered after a long pause. That silence is just another form of preservation. Sometimes what people don't say becomes the loudest truth. Outside, snow began to fall over the harbor, dusting the museum steps. The cold whiteness reflected against the gallery windows until the entire facade shimmered under a pale glow. From inside, through the frost, Evelyn's painting looked almost alive in the light, like she might turn her head at any moment. As days passed, the exhibition drew record crowds. Art critics called it one of the defining moments of modern cultural reckoning. Classes from universities across the East Coast came to study the works, not for their beauty, but for their evidence of erasure, obsession, and authorship. Reports detailed the emotional reactions visitors had, some breaking into tears, others staying for hours in silence. One evening, near closing time, Neil returned privately to the gallery. Few people remained, and the ambient lighting had been dimmed for conservation. She walked slowly between the frames, scanning the details she now knew by heart. The way Whitford captured light, the subtle repetition of his touch, the impossibility of detaching the artist's hand from the subject's essence. It was all still too human to dismiss. As she approached Evelyn's portrait, she noticed something new. A faint crack had formed near the lower right corner of the glass. Beneath it, a tiny fragment of paint had lifted from the surface, revealing the outline of another eye, smaller, unknown. The restoration team insisted the crack was normal stress from humidity, but Neil knew better. Whitford had always hidden faces, always layered truth beneath what others were meant to see. That night, long after the museum closed, Neil returned to her apartment overlooking the city. The harbor lights shimmered in broken reflections outside her window. Every so often, a newspaper headline about Whitford would still appear. Rumors of sightings, theories that he was alive somewhere in Europe, living under another name. None were credible, but each carried a certain unease. Baltimore never forgot. The art community changed profoundly. Galleries now required authentication, transparency. Schools reformed mentorship systems. Yet beneath the progress, a quiet fascination endured. What drove a man like Whitford to turn art into a ritual of possession? What did he see in his students that made him want to capture them forever? Months later, a package arrived at the museum. No return address. It contained a small 8x10 canvas unsigned. The image was simple, a scene of the Patapsco River at dusk. The colors were muted, the brushwork meticulous, eerily similar to Whitford's. But the most striking thing was what floated faintly in the water's reflection, two silhouettes walking side by side into the horizon. Forensic analysis couldn't verify the age of the paint. Some believed it to be Whitford's final undiscovered piece. Others argued it was a forgery created to exploit the legend. Yet when displayed briefly for study, the public's reaction mirrored the same quiet intensity the earlier works evoked, a sense that something unresolved still lingered. Neil, now retired, was invited to view it privately. Standing before the small canvas, she felt neither fear nor nostalgia, only a strange calm. The figures looked peaceful, as if the story had finally ended. She turned to leave, but before stepping away, she glanced at the signature line one last time. Barely visible under a thin layer of varnish, she noticed a faint mark, half buried, almost erased. Not AW, not ER, but both, intertwined. It was as though, after everything, the lies, the loss, the art, the truth, they had become one final composition. The painting was quietly stored away, sealed among the archives that held Whitford's legacy. The museum lights dimmed, the last visitors left, and in the darkened silence of the gallery, the faint reflection of the harbor moved across Evelyn's, painted eyes glimmering softly, alive, watchful, and eternal. 5 years passed before the story resurfaced again. By then, the name Alan Whitford had faded from most headlines, replaced by new scandals, new artists, new obsessions. Yet in certain corners of Baltimore's academic world, his ghost still lingered. His teachings were no longer cited, his books had gone out of print, and every trace of his scholarly influence had been carefully erased. But history, like paint, never truly dries. It began when a young graduate student named Melissa Crane started Her thesis on forgery detection in 20th century art. She chose the Whitford case as her focus, determined to separate myth from truth. Her advisor warned her that the topic had been exhausted, that every lead had been explored and every painting analyzed. But Melissa wasn't convinced. She believed that something, a key pattern or overlooked clue, still hid beneath the surface. She spent months studying every photograph, restoration log, and forensic report available. Late nights in the archive became routine. She memorized the subtle traits of Whitford's brushwork, the long vertical blends, the swirling underlayers, the way he always softened light coming from the left. What fascinated her wasn't just his technique, it was his compulsion. There was an emotion behind every imperfection, an unresolved dialogue between him and his subjects, especially Evelyn Ross. Then one evening, she found something, a forgotten envelope tucked between lab photographs in the museum's storage files. Inside were 4 Polaroids, faded but intact. They showed a painting not listed in any inventory. The first 3 were angled shots of an unfinished portrait, its face only half rendered. The 4th showed the same painting again, this time complete, signed E. Jerris at the bottom. But Evelyn had disappeared by the time it could have been finished. The date stamped on the back read November 1969, weeks after her disappearance. Melissa froze. It wasn't possible, unless someone else had finished it. She took the images to the museum's director, who confirmed they had never been catalogued. The canvas's fate was unknown. It had simply vanished sometime in the early 70s, along with several others Whitford had supposedly reclaimed during renovations. Melissa began digging deeper, convinced that if this portrait still existed, it could explain everything, the transition between Evelyn's work and Whitford's style, the point where their 2 identities began to merge. Using metadata and old facility receipts, she traced the missing numbers from Micah's restoration log to a single private collector, Harold Asher, a reclusive banker who owned one of Whitford's verified forgeries. It took months and repeated requests, but eventually she was granted a 5-minute inspection. When she stepped into Asher's townhouse, the air smelled faintly of oil varnish and cedar. The man moved slowly, thin and pale, his eyes sharp with suspicion. He led her into a narrow hallway lined with early expressionist works, then stopped before a painting shrouded by black velvet. "You're here for this," he said. "But I should warn you, once you see it, you'll never stop thinking about it." He lifted the cloth. The portrait was as breathtaking. A woman seated at an angle, light falling across one half of her face. Her hair, auburn with streaks of copper, framed her expression, a mixture of exhaustion and defiance. It was Evelyn, unmistakably. But there was something else. The background was distinct from her known works, a muted grey-blue gradient, Whitford's signature environment. At the base of the portrait, faintly visible under reflected light, was another signature pressed into the primer coat, a single A. Melissa leaned closer. Under UV, she could faintly see additional writing beneath the paint, letters forming what looked like "done" together. The implications struck like a jolt. Evelyn hadn't completed her final work alone. Whitford had painted beside her. She asked Asher how the painting came into his possession. He claimed it was delivered anonymously in 1978, insured and authenticated through Whitford's own office. "I was told it was a collaboration," Asher said quietly, "a final act of love between teacher and muse." Melissa wasn't prepared to accept that. She took permission for high-resolution imaging and arranged for lab analysis through the museum's team. The results confirmed her suspicion. 2 distinct pigment sources were used. The left half contained Evelyn's mid-60s formulations, the warm carmine reds, the linseed-heavy base she favored. The right half bore Whitford's later titanium whites and synthetic blends. 2 painters, 1 canvas. The discovery demanded a new narrative. Evelyn hadn't simply been absorbed, she had resisted. The painting was a battlefield, a visual argument frozen in oil. When the museum announced a re-examination of its archives following Melissa's findings, the art world reignited with debate. Experts argued over authorship, intent, agency. Television panels dissected the meaning of co-creation under coercion. Protesters accused the institution of exploiting trauma again for cultural publicity. But for the first time, Evelyn Ross's name appeared above Whitford's in every headline. Within weeks, the museum announced a special showcase, The Unfinished Portrait, Rediscovering Evelyn Ross. Scheduled to open that fall, it would feature the newly authenticated collaboration, alongside letters and photographs recovered from that era. Curators emphasized that this was Evelyn's reclamation, the closing of a generational wound. On the night of the installation, Melissa stayed late in the gallery making last-minute checks. Alone under soft spotlights, she examined the painting one final time. The light caught new ridges on the surface, subtle brushstrokes that seemed to ripple differently than before. For a moment, she thought she saw faint movement in the varnish, like light bending through water. Then she realized what it was. The paint layers had cracked ever so slightly, exposing what lay beneath. Underneath the surface glaze, barely perceptible, two fingerprints crossed each other, one from Evelyn's smaller hand, one from Whitford's larger. Time had fused them into one. Melissa stepped back, her chest tightening with something between awe and sorrow. This portrait wasn't just about possession or violence. It was about permanence, the impossible entanglement of two souls bound by obsession, creation and tragedy. She turned off the lights, the room fading into darkness, except for the faint glow of the exit sign reflected on the glass. The painting caught that thin band of red light, and for a brief instant, Evelyn's face seemed to emerge from shadow once more. Calm, composed, finally complete. Outside, the city lights of Baltimore shimmered on the water, their colors blending just like layers of paint, shifting, merging, a canvas that, no matter how many times the story was retold, would never really be finished. The long-awaited exhibition of The Unfinished Portrait opened on a gray autumn morning in Baltimore. The line wrapped around the Maryland Institute's marble steps, a crowd buzzing with curiosity and reverence. News crews whispered into cameras while professors, students, and collectors spoke in cautious tones. For the first time, Evelyn Ross's final painting, the one she began and her mentor finished, would face the public. Inside, silence ruled. The gallery lights glowed softly against satin-black walls, guiding visitors toward the central piece. At the end of a narrow corridor beneath a golden spotlight stood the portrait that had defined decades of speculation. Evelyn stared from the canvas with an expression both resigned and defiant, her sealed mouth painted over in layers of muted color that seemed to hold 1,000 unspoken things. Melissa Crane, the young researcher responsible for the painting's rediscovery, watched from the corner as visitors approached in careful steps. Every face carried some version of the same reaction, all mixed with discomfort. It was as if the painting looked back at them. Each stroke carried tension, two artists locked within one image, their struggle immortalized in pigment. Halfway down the hall, a thin man in a beige coat stopped beside her. "You're Melissa Crane?" he asked, voice deliberate. He introduced himself as Arthur Pembroke, a retired police archivist. "I followed this case before your time," he said quietly, handing her a small yellowed folder. "Found something last month in storage." It was never logged. Inside were two old black and white photographs, a wooden box etched with ER, and inside it, a palette knife engraved with Whitford's initials. A police tag beneath the image read, "Recovered 1970, awaiting analysis." A note pinned beside it. "Possible biological residue. Authorization pending." It had never been tested. Melissa's pulse quickened. The photographs were dated months after Evelyn's disappearance. If Whitford's tool had surfaced that late, someone must have placed it there after the investigation had closed. She promised to have the items retested immediately. Pembroke simply nodded. "Just be careful," he said. "Some art never wants to be found." That evening, when the crowd dispersed and silence returned, Melissa stayed behind to review the materials. She wandered among the darkened halls, lit now only by amber nightlights. The painting seemed to shift with each step she took. From one angle, Evelyn looked sorrowful. From another, accusatory. Exhaustion, she told herself, but still she couldn't bring herself to leave. As she circled the frame, something caught her eye, a glint of metal jutting slightly beneath the wood molding. She bent closer and saw a small rusted nailhead, old and uneven. None of the restoration reports mentioned it. Peeling back a section of paper lining behind the frame, She found a narrow slit, sealed with adhesive far newer than the canvas itself. Inside, folded tightly and nearly fused to the backing, was a brittle scrap of paper. Under her desk lamp, the faded ink revealed 5 words. She finished what I started. No signature. The handwriting, once analyzed, matched Alan Whitford's, but the note didn't fit the established timeline. He couldn't have written it before disappearing. It referenced her finishing something after her death. Either someone forged it, or Whitford had returned to the painting long after it was believed completed. News of the discovery exploded across the art world. Theories multiplied. Some claimed the message proved Whitford viewed Evelyn as a collaborator rather than a victim. Others saw it as one last taunt, a twisted declaration of ownership. Investigators reopened aspects of the case, examining every painting Whitford ever authenticated. Whispers spread that other works in Europe bore uncanny similarities to Evelyn's forgotten pieces, as if her style had been quietly living under false names for decades. To the museum, the revelation became the centerpiece of its narrative. Attendance tripled. Guests stood in line for hours to glimpse what reporters dubbed the conversation in paint. But for Melissa, the note haunted every quiet hour. She had touched the page that Whitford likely folded with his own hands, a man whose crimes blurred life and art so thoroughly that no one could tell where guilt ended and creation began. 1 week later, another file arrived from overseas. The gallery in Antwerp reported a small unsigned portrait that shared Whitford's brush patterns and varnish layers. The image showed a woman reading by candlelight. On the lower frame, 2 initials were carved into the wood. ER. One expert claimed it was forgery. Another whispered it might be Evelyn's lost work, altered, repainted, disguised. Melissa flew to Antwerp to verify it, only to find the painting already sold to a private buyer who refused to disclose their identity. The case stretched further, tangling across continents and closing whatever distance time had created between Whitford's legend and his victims. When she returned home, the exhibition still stood unchanged, but somehow heavier. Late one night, she entered the gallery alone and faced the portrait, her reflection faintly visible in the glass. "Did you ever escape him?" she whispered. The overhead lights flickered. In the half-dark, it almost seemed that Evelyn's painted eyes glimmered, alive for a second before the shadows consumed them again. The faint smell of turpentine lingered in the still air, and though the world believed the story was over, Melissa realized what every restorer eventually learns: some paintings never stop changing. They breathe, they decay, they endure. So did the truth. Winter settled over Baltimore like a quiet reckoning. The unfinished portrait still hung in the Maryland Institute's gallery, surrounded by more questions than admirers. Since the discovery of Whitford's note, she finished what I started. The exhibition had lost its shine. The city no longer saw a masterpiece in the canvas, only a sealed argument between artist and victim that refused to rest. Melissa Crane couldn't walk away. Even after the investigation closed, she spent her nights alone in that gallery, standing before Evelyn Ross's face as if waiting for it to speak. The cleaning crews got used to seeing her silhouette in the dark, motionless, notebook in hand, tracing invisible lines in the air. She told herself she was documenting, but privately she knew she was listening. One evening in December, as snow tapped softly against the high windows, Melissa examined the painting under ultraviolet light. What she saw tightened her chest. Beneath the visible layers appeared another face, faint but unmistakable. Evelyn again turned slightly aside and half erased. The painting wasn't just theirs. It was both of them layered into one. Whitford hadn't merely finished her work. He had buried her beneath his own brushstrokes. She saved the scans to the museum's system. By morning, the files were gone, corrupted, unrecoverable. That same night, motion alarms triggered inside the locked gallery. Security found nothing missing, but on the frame's lower ledge rested a fresh smear of yellow pigment. They called it residue. Melissa called it impossible. Soon after, curators decided to remove the painting for conservation. Rumors spread that Evelyn's expression was changing, her eyes softer some days, sharper the next. Visitors swore her mouth shifted slightly in the glow. The official explanation blamed lighting variations, but no technology could explain movement sealed under decades of varnish. Driven by unease, Melissa traveled to New York to speak with a retired conservator who'd once worked under Whitford. The moment she mentioned the painting, the old man lowered his gaze. He couldn't separate himself from it, he said quietly. He said he wanted to live inside it. So stay with her. When she pressed for details, he handed her an envelope containing an old Polaroid. In it, Whitford stood beside a large painting that mirrored Evelyn's, the same composition reversed like a reflection. Beneath scrawled handwriting read, Baltimore 1971, second study complete. Melissa's hands trembled. There had been another painting, its twin. Whitford hadn't stopped at one. Back in Baltimore under heavy snow, she entered the gallery after hours. The painting loomed under dim security lights, the room thick with still air. She noticed a crack near the right corner of the frame widening slightly. From it protruded a thin edge of paper. She pried it out carefully and unfolded it. Written in fading graphite were 3 words, "Find the mirror." Her reflection stared back at her from the glass covering Evelyn's portrait. And then beneath it she saw something, softer shapes, shadows. A trace of another face faintly emerging below the layers. Whitford was still there, hidden beneath hers, painted in reverse. The mirror was real, but it wasn't somewhere else. It was inside the same canvas, invisible and inverted. Evelyn's face and Whitford's were bound together, their identities fused through oil and pigment. One painted over, the other underneath, both fighting for permanence. He hadn't stolen her art. He had turned her into his. Every restoration, every public viewing had unknowingly sustained that entanglement. Melissa stood frozen, the realization pressing on her like a weight. In the reflection, her own image overlapped theirs. For a brief moment, she couldn't tell where her face ended and Evelyn's began. The varnish shimmered faintly under the cold light, her breath fogging the glass. By the next morning, she filed her findings, a secondary portrait confirmed beneath the surface. The museum sealed the exhibit again, labeling it too unstable for display. Reporters called it closure. But Melissa couldn't sleep that night, certain she'd only uncovered the beginning of something deeper. At dawn, she walked past the harbor, watching ice form over the dark water. In the reflection of the museum's window, she could still see the painting's faint outline through the glass, Evelyn looking outward, soft but watchful. And below her, just barely visible, the suggestion of another presence staring back. The city moved on. The gallery closed. But in that sealed room, beneath centuries of varnish and silence, Whitford's final act endured. A layer of himself buried within the face of the woman he couldn't let go. The world called it tragedy. Whitford would have called it eternity. For years, these cases were forgotten. But the truth doesn't stay buried forever. Here we reopen the files, reveal the evidence, and give a voice to those who were silenced. Subscribe now and step inside the archive where time, lies, and justice finally meet. Because every secret eventually speaks.